Hi, I'm Bryan Caplan. I am the author of the new Pro Market and Pro Business essays on laissez-faire, as well as a lot of other books. And today I have with me my mentor, Sheldon Richman. I met Sheldon Richman in 1989 at the Mises University when I was right out of high school, and we have been good friends ever since. He had a lot of time to talk to an ignorant and intellectually enthusiastic high school student, namely me, when I barely knew anything but thought I had all the answers. Then he was actually the person running the Cato Institute's internship program the summer of 1991. So I got to hang out with Sheldon every day then. Sheldon is a person that has always had time for me when I was a complete nobody, and I've always appreciated it. Sheldon is someone who I'll just say, like this. I don't mean to embarrass you, Sheldon, but I really wish you were one of my blood relatives because getting to see you every holiday would be so great. Sheldon has a fantastic sense of humor. He's just a super lovable guy. He's had a lot of different positions in the libertarian world and in the world of journalism generally. But to me, I just think of him as an independent thinker, a curious person, someone with a great sense of humor, and of course, a great love of liberty, an autodidact, someone who knows history, economics, current events, philosophy, just a wide range of issues. So, uh, anyway, the reason I brought Sheldon on in part is Sheldon, at least for a while, was closely associated with the idea of left libertarianism and what that means we can talk about. But I also, so a lot of the idea of left libertarianism is libertarians can actually accept a lot of the complaints of the mainstream left against business and just say, well, in a real free market, it wouldn't be that way. Interesting idea in any case. Since I have this new book out in praise of business, I wanted to get Sheldon on here to talk about a lot of this stuff. So why don't I just begin by asking Sheldon, so Sheldon, what do you think about business?
Well, before I answer that question, I have to, being the contentious person I am, I must rebut the introduction. I just feel
All right, go
obligated.
ahead. Be
I
my
feel
guest.
obligated. No, no, I'm not really rebut it. First of all, you way have inflated my expertise and wide ranging. I mean, when I am aware of what the things you have read, I feel, oh my gosh, I can't, I can't, hit a fraction of that. But and about giving you time when we first met, and then at the over that extended period at Cato, I never thought of it that way. I always thought you were somebody I could learn from, and I say that in all sincerity. You just seem to be. I know the first time at the that week long seminar at Stanford in would you say '89?
89.
I
Yeah.
guess I knew you were right out of high school, but
Yep.
you just seemed to be a guy who knew a lot, and I was impressed with you
Well, a lot less
right
than I
right
thought.
away. And
All right. All right.
okay,
Totally
we'll put that
appreciating,
aside
but
now.
what do you think about business, Sheldon?
Well, I'm pro business to coin a phrase, if I could coin a phrase. I like I like business. I mean, my apartment is filled of stuff with stuff that I got from business of various kinds. Um, and I was very happy to see your book come out, the collection of essays, and that being the title essay, because I did go through a brief period. We'll talk about this where I believe I overemphasized the fact that
Mhm.
businesses often go for favors from the state, uh, and that can that should have a bad name generally
Mhm.
in the public. It's considered fairly normal, I guess, among most people, and I think maybe I put too much emphasis on that and thought that was much more pervasive than I really believe it is. I think you and Tyler Cowan and others have taught me that that was overemphasized. And I don't think I said anything that was wrong or that I don't believe today, but it's a matter of where you give emphasis.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
So,
so
what do
that's
you think about all of the libertarians and free market people who are so eager to say, "Look, I'm pro market but not pro business"? Where do you think they're going wrong?
well, I think that only came from this relatively small group of people who called themselves left libertarians.
So I actually beg to differ. I think it's actually very
Okay.
common among
Oh,
Chicago
really? Okay.
economists.
Well, I'm surprised.
Like take Scott Sumner, my former co-blogger at Econlog.
Okay.
No
Okay.
left libertarian sympathies at all, but
I didn't know that.
and he reacted quite negatively to the original essay and said, "No, no,
Oh,
I'm only pro-market. I'm not pro-business." It's very common for economists, someone like Stigler. I think even Milton Friedman. I'm not sure, but I think he
okay.
said similar
Well,
things.
I'm
Of
surprised then.
basically, we only like the results of the process. We are not, in fact, sympathetic towards the participants in the process.
Well, and I think that's really good the way you bring that out, not just in your initial in the title essay, but in a few others. You have one in there about your own experience at producing what was it, T-shirts during
Yeah.
COVID, and all the headaches and problems and getting things done, and you were basically saying, thank goodness I don't have to do this full time. I'm not in business. I'm not running a firm. I'd go crazy through this from this.
Hmm.
Uh, when I think of business, I mean, that term has a few different senses. First of all, the institution of
Hmm.
business. Well, I'm certainly in favor of the institution of business.
Hmm.
You can dislike individual business people, just like
Hmm.
I may dislike individual nurses, but I'm very happy with the institution of
Hmm.
nursing. Thank goodness
Hmm.
for it. Well, I can, that works with business too. So I can dislike a particular businessman. I mean, you know, I don't dislike Bezos. I know a lot of people don't like him.
Hmm.
I'm not sure why. Uh, but I don't see how that would lead you to not like business just because you don't like a particular business person. Uh,
Hmm.
so I don't get that.
I mean, this is.
I don't know Scott Sumner's work very well, but I
Mhm.
never noticed it coming through Friedman. So that's why I said what I said. I'm surprised
Mhm.
at your reaction to that, and I learned from it.
Mhm. So first of all, I think a lot of complaints about business come down to they have a lot of greed, one of the seven deadly sins, and therefore they are bad people. What do you think
Well,
about that?
greed. I have to invoke a Rand concept here. That's an anti-concept.
Hmm.
It's always the other person who's greedy, not me.
Hmm.
And so when I hear people say anything's greedy, I basically discount it.
Hmm.
Tell me what they did. Did they actually do something wrong? I mean, how can you say, well, they want money too much?
Hmm.
They're not cheating, they're honest, but they just want too much money, or they want money too much. My reaction to that is mind your own business. How do you know what's too much? What do you, a meter? You have like a Greedo meter. Oh, he's over the line.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, I'm not a person who's out to, get every penny I can get, all within the honest. So I probably would never get called greedy, but I'm not going to go calling Bezos or
Hmm.
anybody else greedy.
Hmm. I can see if, as a parent, for example, if you had a kid who all they cared about was money and they just had no other interests, you might say,
Well, sure.
I think they've got a problem, and I want to go and say, there's more to life than money.
Yeah. Oh,
My younger son, whenever he's thinking about jobs, it's only how much money it makes. And I'm like, look, you're actually going to be doing this job, you realize. And look, it's like there are a lot of other things you can be doing that you might like more that you would still have plenty of money. So, the idea of greed being something that people can take too far, I do understand that. Although it's one where actually it's mostly as a paternalist that I can understand the problem with greed. If it's someone you care about and all they care about is money, you're like
yeah.
really messing up your life by not appreciating other things. Whereas if it's someone that you just interact with in business, it's like, well, I mean, I guess it's kind of unfortunate for them that they have such a narrow view of life, and yet it's advantageous to me that every time I pick up my phone and ask them to go and do some work for me, they're right there.
Yeah. Well, look, what you said about you and your son, that's good parenting. Uh, that's not the relationship, something you stress in a couple of your chapters. That's not a relationship you have with business people. I
Mhm.
mean, if somebody were to ask me, do you think Jeff Bezos is greedy? I'd say, well, however you're defining it, how the hell do I know? I don't know what the guy's personal life is like.
Mhm.
I just know he set up an amazing business, and I can get something delivered off in just the next day, uh, or certainly 2 days, and the prices are good. So is he
Mhm.
greedy? How would I? Does he want money too much? How would I know? I don't know the guy. So that's true of like every businessman I do business with.
I mean, I would tend to use the reasoning of, well, look, there's a big competition in the world to go and be successful in business. there are trade-offs that people make, and if you put a lot of value on things other than money, you're likely to lose out to people that only put value on money. It's very much the same as with the Olympics. If you're to say, like, do you think those Olympians have a narrow view of what matters in life? I'm like, yeah, they how could they possibly be at the top if they didn't have a narrow view of what
Yeah.
matters in life? And that's my view of people who are hyper successful in business is, yeah, it's possible they're just so hyper talented that they can put in 10% of their mental energy and be number one in the world, but that would be a miracle. They probably are people who are neglecting other things in life, which, again, if you personally cared about them as your son, you might think was unfortunate. But from the point of view of a consumer, it's like, well, isn't it wonderful? This person is so focused on making me happy.
Well, that's right. I mean, in a way, that's what that person is doing. I
Mhm.
once heard it attributed to Charles Koch, and I worked for several
Mhm.
organizations that were, seeded originally by Koch. He sat
Wait,
on the
wait, the
board.
Coctopus? You would be associated with the Coctopus,
Hey,
Phil?
when I got my first job in the libertarian movement, because I had been a reporter and then I spent a year teaching writing as a consultant, we would go into big companies and teach technical people how to write plainly for the salespeople.
I actually remember your writing for economics class in 1989. It was good.
Well, and my friend who got me that job was Dave Barry, the great
Ah, Dave.
comedy writer and
Yeah.
libertarian. He credits me. Anyway, when I first got hired to work for a now defunct, long defunct organization, the Council for Competitive Economy, in 1979 or so, uh, I got a call from Charles Koch. I just moved into a new apartment in Wilmington, Delaware, and he said, I'm forming a new organization, a laissez-faire counterpart to the Chamber of Commerce. Would you want to work for us? We're putting a staff together. David Bose was the executive director. The sadly late David Bose. Really missed the guy.
We
He
do.
was a longtime friend. I mean, I knew him from those days.
And
And I
he
said,
was there
and
in
I,
case
and I said
91.
to Charles Koch, forgetting who I was talking to, I said, I just signed a lease. I don't know if I can get out of it. I mean, that's kind of funny thing to say. Charles Koch was probably a rounding error to buy out the lease, which I guess we did. But anyway, I heard it attributed to him that he had plenty of money even back then, right? That money at that point for his business was just scorekeeping. In other words, how were we doing? It wasn't that he needed the money. So,
Mhm.
and I never got to know him really personally. I saw him a
Mhm.
couple times and chatted
Mhm.
and greeted him, but I certainly never had the sense that he's one of the people you're talking about who's so focused, all he cares about is money.
Mhm.
How can I tell about any given business person
Mhm.
what his personal habits, and
Mhm.
lifestyle are like, and I don't think about it. And I agree with you. I like the services. That's another thing comes through your book. We have all these people who are, spending day and night trying to come up with new ideas to please us. I mean,
Mhm.
and yet they're seeing it as in their self-interest. I mean, what a system! What a system! That in pursuing their self-interest, they're working overtime to think of things that we will love to have at prices we're happy to pay, and delivery delivery times that are unbelievable. Pretty soon we'll be getting them before we order. Before we ordered. So who can ask for a better system than that?
Yeah, so in the modern economy, I do have a lot of trouble understanding someone who, as a consumer, has a problem with business. It's a lot easier for me to see how people don't like business in their role as a worker. What do you think about that, Sheldon?
Well, I've always been a worker. I mean,
You've never run a business of any kind?
no, and I have no aptitude. My father was operated a small neighborhood a real estate agent office that maybe at most had two salesmen, so it wasn't like a big
Mhm.
company, and it was just a little bit of apartment management, but selling houses. I remember growing up saying, what do you do, Daddy? And he said, "Oh, I sell houses." I said, "Really? You have a store where there are houses? Let's see that." I kind of remember thinking that. So no, I never ran a business, and this will edge into the left libertarian stuff. Of course, when I say anything about left libertarianism, I'm speaking purely for myself. I don't know what specifically motivated any other given individual. I can tell you what attracted me to that,
Mhm.
and I think of it as an emphasis, a form of
Mhm.
emphasis. Um, I have no interest in running a business or having the headaches that would be involved. When I hear people like Richard Wolff lament that we don't have worker-owned firms and factories and round-the-clock democracy, I think, thank goodness. Who'd want to be in all the meetings? I want to go home at 5 o'clock. I always wanted to go home at 5 o'clock. When I got to an organization, I never thought I'm going to be president or at least the executive vice president of this someday. So I'm going to put in long hours and be there early in the morning and work till 8 or 9 o'clock. No, I wanted to get home. I want to leave at 5. The boss doesn't leave at 5. So no, I never ran a business and I wouldn't have wanted to run a business. And I believe that's probably true of most people. They would hear, I think most people, if they heard Richard Wolff's description of what he thinks workers really want, I mean, he seems to be under this delusion. I think they'd laugh at him and say, "You got to be crazy." No, I don't. I want to get paid. I never missed a paycheck. I always got a paycheck at the appointed time. No one ever said, "Oh, we're short of funds. Can we pay you next week?" Never missed a paycheck.
So let me this way, I can really understand someone who says, you know what, I want to be like Bryan, I want to be like you. I want to be able to make a lot of money in the public sector where I don't really have to work hard or serve consumers or worry about losing my job, and then take all that money and spend it in the free market where people are struggling very hard to please me. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, if that's what they want, I mean, they may have a misleading view of your life.
I think actually I'd say it's a pretty accurate view of my life. I do.
You're probably a hardworking
Yeah.
academic, even with tenure. I'm sure you're hardworking. You may not fear being fired, but you're probably hardworking. You do want to get good.
Maybe relatively, but you know, when I go and look at what successful people with private sector jobs are doing, I think my job is really quite easy. And especially the point of I just have basically zero job stress because I'm the only one who decides whether what I'm doing is good.
Oh no, that's
And,
another
and,
good
and
point.
in a normal market job, you don't get to self-assess.
No, that's true. I never wanted to be an academic.
Mhm.
I did not go to graduate school. I have a bachelor's
Mhm.
in, I guess it's science, but it's in communications, radio, TV, film. Only 2 years, this relates to your education stuff. Only 2 years of my entire life that I work in my major. And it was at Cato because we started doing TV on a fledgling cable network back then. We're talking about the early 1990s, right?
I get it.
And we had a weekly show. We paid to be on this network. And Ed Crane came to me after doing 1 or 2 episodes. Said, "You could handle the production of this, couldn't you?" Not, I don't think he knew my major. He wasn't saying it to me because it was my major.
Yeah, sure.
He just thought I'd be good at it. And I did that for 2 years. Hey, that was the only time I ever worked in my major. So I never wanted to be an academic. Now, later on, I took a few graduate courses at Mason when I was at the
Mhm.
Institute for Humane Studies. I guess I was, yeah,
Mhm.
Institute for Humane Studies. And, I wanted to write the papers. I wasn't really planning to work toward a degree. I didn't need a master's degree. I didn't want to go into teaching. But I wrote some papers and I actually got them published in the old Journal of Libertarian Studies. And that was fun. I did some original research on various
Mhm.
topics. But
You
I
published
didn't want to.
America First in the 1930s, didn't you? Am I correct? Do I remember?
I did not America First, the American Liberty League,
Liberty, yes.
which the DuPonts and some others put together. In fact, and I did original research in the DuPont facility in Eleutherian Mills, I believe it's called, where all those papers are. And then I did something on the abolitionists who were opposed the Civil War, and I spent a lot of time in the Swarthmore Peace Library where they had diaries and stuff. So that was my real contact with doing some primary source historical work. And I think those were decent papers. And Rothbard published that and one I did on the new economic policy, which I called The Road from Serfdom. And he also published that. Now, that wasn't original research because I don't read Russian, unfortunately. So I had to work on use secondary sources.
Yeah. Now, what I would say to the person who says, well, really the best thing is to earn your money, quote unquote, in the public sector and then spend it in the private sector is that's not really a system, right? This isn't something that everybody can do. If everybody was in the public sector, there wouldn't be anything in the stores. And really then step back and say, well, which system is actually one that would generally be good? It's like a system where everybody just gets paid to do whatever they feel like and don't have to produce. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. System where everybody is going and producing stuff to go and make consumers happy. That sounds like a system that actually makes sense. And then from there, it's like, okay, so the reason why people are in the private sector often not so happy with their jobs is basically they're being given a trade-off between life satisfaction and money. And a lot of what you're getting paid for is just to accept my life satisfaction isn't going to be the only thing that matters to me. I'm going to go and give up some life satisfaction to go and get some other stuff. And then to realize, there is of course, there's a range of different jobs that you can do, but the idea that it's good to have one where taxpayers support it and allow people to go and have a great life and have nice quality of life and money while being supported by taxpayers is really just a totally parasitic system. So, that's my
Yeah.
view of it. I mean, like, did you read the book Nickel and Dined, by the way, Barbara Ehrenreich?
No, I've only I remember reading reviews of it.
Yes. So, like, my view is, this is actually a great book. It's unintentionally a great book
Mhm.
because, like just, Aaron Reich is just so dogmatically left wing that
Yeah.
she doesn't understand the facts that she's reporting or how someone that disagreed with her ideology would interpret them. But basically, she goes undercover, works a bunch of low skilled jobs, and then comes away saying, well, low skilled workers are treated very badly. But you read the book and it's like, well, the problem is that the kind of workers you're talking about are not likely to respond very well to the upper middle class management style where you just say, well, everybody just do a good job. I count on everyone to be a professional. They just aren't that committed to the jobs. And so, first of all, you need to have harsher discipline to get the job done with a workforce like that. And then, secondly, also realizing someone who had really good people skills wouldn't want to be the manager of a diner.
Mhm.
They would want to go and be managing some upper middle class workforce where they had a more pleasant quality of life. The people that are managing a diner are going to be very good diner workers who are still coming from that same social class. And so it's not at all surprising that by middle and upper class standards, they're boorish and ill-mannered and
Yeah.
just insensitive. But again, it's one where, of course, she just wants to say this is all caused by capitalism, and it's like, look, there's a lot of
Right.
occupations that are totally different from these ones. So why don't you sit back and say it can't be capitalism in general that explains why these workers are getting yelled at and being called mean names by their boss? Because if it were capitalism, then also lawyers should be getting called mean names and yelled at by their boss. And if you talk to almost anyone who works at a lawyer, it's much more of, oh, would you mind taking a look at this work?
Yeah.
And just realize, like, if you use that kind of language in a diner, people would just think you were crazy. But in a lot of
Well,
this, it's understood that's how we
yeah.
talk to each other, and there's actually some pretty thinly veiled threats behind that. Like, if you don't feel like taking a little look at it, then you're going to get fired. But that's all of what's going on, and it's just a lot more complicated than what she's saying. And yet, also, you step back and realize, well, like, in a deeper sense, this is a functional system, and she's just judging it unfairly.
Well, the easiest thing to do is blame business or blame capitalism if you want to inflate it even more, blame the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Something you've referred to a few times, I've heard you say in different interviews and talks, and I guess it's going to be part of a forthcoming book uh, from you, is that people do make bad choices in life and they don't prepare themselves. This is something you get from Thomas Sowell. I see many interviews
Yep.
with him, older interviews on YouTube with him, where he brings this out. I mean, people do make bad choices, and then intellectuals often look down on the problems that come from those bad choices, and then they don't say you made bad choices. They say
Mm-hmm.
it's a bad system, and
Mm-hmm.
I take it this is something you're going to be developing in
Oh
one of those
yeah.
books, and it's important. It doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
people individuals don't suffer misfortune and have a rough time. That's not any fault of theirs, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think we tend not to want to say, maybe it's social desirability bias. Maybe we don't want to
What
say
social
a lot
desirability
of
bias? What's that, Sheldon?
the point of phrase. And yeah, I know you've never heard of this, but uh,
Wait. I think I
it
remember.
doesn't sound good to
Is it the
say.
tendency of people to lie when the truth is ugly? Is it that?
I was going to say people don't like to say, in truth, I think a lot of people's hard luck is they brought it on themselves. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean everybody, and it's not. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean we're callous.
Hmm.
And don't maybe feel bad, but as you point out, people
Hmm.
do make bad choices. I mean, what's the thing you also cite? Not in the book, but many times I've heard you say, "What are the three rules of avoiding
Oh
poverty?"
yes.
Finish high
Yep.
school, don't have kids before you're married, and get a full time job, and don't have
Yep.
kids before you're married.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the chances of being in poverty are very very small.
Mhm. Right. And also very worth pointing out that when someone accuses you of being callous, you might well say, well, you're being callous towards the people that are being victimized by this person's poor choices. So if
The
there's
forgotten man.
Yeah, there's someone who's dad who's a very heavy drinker, so he's out of work and he's mean to his kids. If you say, well, he's a victim, it says, well, what does that make his family?
Yeah.
Like
No,
they're they're they're,
and the
they're
reason
bad people because they don't think that his behavior is is responsible or justifiable. So I would always say, remember that, at minimum, just think about taking sides in something like this. And the classic cop out to say, oh, well, they're all victims of the system. And it's like, well, how come the family next door where the dad doesn't have a drinking problem, they're
yeah.
doing fine? Why doesn't the system mess them up somehow?
Right. No, I think that's right. And this year I read, or in some cases reread, William Graham Sumner.
Hmm.
Forgotten Man is something he wrote in a few
Yep.
different ways. And,
Yep.
I kept thinking, wow, nobody talks like this.
Hmm.
You're an exception, but you just don't hear that very much. I mean, occasionally you'll hear some reference to it. What about the poor taxpayer? You know, and,
Yeah,
and
so the greatest American apostle of Herbert Spencer, correct?
Herbert Spencer. Yeah.
Yes. So would it
Yeah.
correct that Sumner was the number one
Yeah.
best American apostle of Spencer?
And very close to total laissez-faire, as close as
Mhm.
anybody got, certainly in his day. Very important. I mean, a founder, what is he considered, the father of American sociology, Yale
Mhm.
professor, Yale,
Mhm.
uh, against war, against empire. I mean, he wrote the great, the thing about the conquest of the United States by Spain, but
Mhm.
that's not our topic. He also talked about the forgotten man and what social uh,
Mhm.
classes owe to each other, and where he talks about we owe decency, but let's not stand in the way of the hardworking people who end up paying all the taxes and who just get forgotten. They're just supposed to be there. There's kind of a Randian element there, right? An
Mhm.
Ayn Rand
Sure.
element. I don't know whether she ever read Sumner, but she certainly reflects some of that. What about the people
Yeah.
that just work hard?
I think she had a really negative throwaway comment about Spencer, probably
Yeah, she did.
probably in the title essay for a new
Yeah,
intellectual.
I
And
believe that's right. It's
yes,
been a long time since I read that, but I
yes,
remember the reference to Spencer.
right. Rand,
And Spencer was also odd too, because I remember Spencer writing in some place that it was altruism was in your self-interest. So he kind
Mhm.
of blurred the line between.
Mhm.
I remember talking to Mario Rizzo about this once, and we chatted about that. He said, "Yeah, that is a little peculiar." But anyway, we don't need to go into that.
Yeah, I just got a new quip about Rand. Tell me what you think. Rand was a great writer, but not a great reader.
I've heard that sort of thing said about her that, and so yeah, I don't know the real facts there. She certainly talked to people. She was close to, some of her acolytes were people who got PhDs in philosophy. So she must have been, milking them for information about Kant, and
Yeah.
she,
It says that it's actually that Michael Berliner book of her Marginalia, which gives us an idea about what she was reading.
no,
But
uh-huh,
I think it does give the impression of, she's like, not only not a charitable reader, but probably not even really a fair reader. There's a giant Columbus complex that she's got. All right. So part of the reason I brought you on here, Sheldon, is that for at least some years you were associated with a view called left libertarianism. Now let's just to back up. So when 1991, when I was seeing you every day, I don't think you had any interest in these ideas. And then these days, it seems like, again, you're not too supportive. So could you just describe how you got interested,
well,
what your role was?
again, I do see it as a matter of emphasis. Now, others
Okay,
may not see it that way,
right.
but
But
I
yeah,
do.
like 1991, you weren't talking about this at all, right?
No, 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 no. This is early this century, and I only learned belatedly that you were writing blog posts in 2010, and I
Hmm.
was editor of the Freeman at the time. I don't know
Ah,
why I don't know why I didn't become aware of those blog posts until this year or last year. If I
hmm.
had seen those blog posts and I was editor of the Freeman, I would have gotten you on the phone immediately saying, Bryan, I need an article for the Freeman on this stuff. I would have, and I would have published it, no doubt
All
about it.
right,
So
all right,
I don't know how you weren't sending them to me. And
all
even
right.
though my name got mentioned in at least one of them,
Yeah.
I don't know why I wasn't aware of them.
All
Unless I
right.
have a blackout in my memory and I don't drink, so it can't be that.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, what I
So,
was,
but you could just describe what was the
yeah.
thought process
Well,
that led
okay.
you
Number
to get
one,
interested in this?
I don't want to be known as a right winger. I
Okay.
haven't thought of myself as a right winger since about 1960, shortly after the Goldwater campaign. I mean,
Mhm.
Goldwater was my awakening, which is
Mhm.
typical for somebody as old as I am, a libertarian my age.
Mhm.
It all doesn't usually begin with Ayn Rand. It usually begins with Barry Goldwater. And
All
I was
right.
very excited about that. I wasn't thinking much about foreign policy, but but the idea of individual liberty and limits to government power. I always liked stories about the American Revolution,
Yep.
freedom and all that stuff. So when I learned the word libertarian, 66, 67, something like that, I didn't think of myself as a right winger.
Mhm.
So the idea of calling myself a left libertarian sounded, in the early part of this century, especially with Bush and all this stuff going on with
Mhm.
wars,
Mhm.
uh, sounded attractive to me.
Mhm.
And then I also was attracted to the idea that, on the one hand, it's what Kevin Carson calls vulgar libertarianism. I think there
Mhm.
is a grain of truth there. On the
Could
one
you,
hand,
sorry, you could just back up. So tell everybody who Kevin Carson
well,
is.
Kevin Carson, who's not a libertarian, and I don't think he certainly would not accept the label today. But he wrote a book that was in the spirit of Proudhon and the late 19th century, early 20th century libertarians, Benjamin Tucker and the people around him. And so he did a book on that, and it's been a long time since I read it. But it's sort of anarchist. It certainly was presented as pro-market. I mean, he praised the Tuckerites for claiming that they were consistent Manchester men. Well,
Mhm.
that's Cobden and Bright, and I loved Cobden and Bright long before that. I
Right.
love
And for
Tucker,
any younger viewers, this is about Benjamin Tucker for the 19th century, not,
yeah,
not the Tucker that we know today.
or a couple different Tuckers.
Yes, yes.
There's a
Yeah, but
couple
no,
Tuckers
not
floating around.
Tucker Carlson, Benjamin Tucker is who we're talking
No,
about.
this was a group of anarchists in the late 19th century into the 20th century. They published a magazine called Liberty, and
Hmm.
it was I mean, it had problems, and Rothbard, criticized them, even though he liked some of them. But he liked some aspects of them. But they were labor theorists. Unfortunately, they did not know about.
Right.
I mean, he shows no signs of knowing about Menger or any of the marginal theorists.
Yes.
So that's a big flaw. That led to problems.
Okay, so
But
anyway, so you read Kevin Carson around when?
uh, I don't know exactly. 2005. I don't know when that book came
2005.
out.
Okay.
It was before. So if you started writing in 2010, doing blog posts
Mhm.
criticizing it, it would have been in that first decade of the 20th. It certainly was
Sure,
the
sure.
first decade of the 21st century.
Okay.
So one of the points, the point that most attracted me was what seemed to be some contradiction in libertarians, and it depends on how you word it, of course. But on the one hand, we're saying there's so much regulation and so much subsidy, and it's such a
Mhm.
mixed economy. It's not laissez-faire. It's not close to capitalism at all. On the other hand, as he pointed out, when the left attacked a corporation for doing something, a lot of libertarians would respond, "Well, if it wasn't serving consumers, they wouldn't be doing it. So what are you complaining about?" So he said, "Wait a second, libertarians, this seems like a contradiction. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you're complaining about all the regulation and distortions at the
Mhm.
hands of the government and often being requested by business. But Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday,
Mhm.
you're saying you're speaking as if they're living in a laissez-faire environment, and anything they do either will turn out to be consumer enhancing or they'll stop doing it because you got to make
Mhm.
a profit." And
Mhm.
I thought that was a valid point. It can be overstated, maybe,
Mhm.
but it did lead me to think that regulation and subsidy is more pervasive than I think, in fact, it really is. And with time, that kind of shrunk back to its proper dimensions.
Although, so just to put this in a bit of context, so you have someone like Ayn Rand who has a pretty simple view of government and markets in the sense of government is primarily just making life really hard for business and is expropriating them and exploiting them. And sure, there's a few collaborationist businesses that are in bed with the government, but the main thing that's going on is using antitrust law to take down the great men. So you'll have, Ayn Rand's line, big business is America's most
Yeah,
persecuted minority.
and I like that speech.
Yes. Pardon?
I like that speech.
You love that speech. For a second, I thought you said you wrote that speech. Like,
Oh
wait
no,
a
no,
second. Yeah.
I
Little
never met her. I saw her
just
at the
moment in my
404.
timeline, Sheldon,
I
but
never met her. I saw her at the
oh, really? So you
404 one year.
never met Rand. But anyway, but then like so, Rothbard in particular, but also quite a few Chicago economists had this, had this contrary view. They said, no, what's really going on is that most regulation is basically industry capture, where business gets in bed with the government, like with airline regulation. And so, actually, contrary to this Randian view, really business likes regulation for the most part. It benefits them. It's a way of keeping out competition.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing that's going on, right? So, and this is why, as you
Well,
may recall, probably, there were like, so you almost certainly remember the name of Gabriel Kolko,
Yes.
who was a Marxist historian who
Yeah.
rewrote the history of the progressive era, saying that actually a lot of the stuff was pushed by business rather than by progressive activists.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, two
Yeah.
things. On Rand, I think you're a little unfair to Rand, maybe more than a little, because first of all, Atlas Shrugged is filled with business people who are trying to use the state. Number two, that lecture she gave at Fort Hall Forum about the persecuted minority is filled with references to businessmen seeking favors. So it wasn't only about how antitrust persecutes business; it was very even-handed.
Well, so here's what I'll say. Like, I do think I've read Rand very closely, and I have an essay on this point. What I'll say is yes, she definitely has a bunch of corrupt businessman characters, but the main thing we're supposed to see is that the business world in general has been devastated by these policies. So it's just a small percentage of bad apples that have ruined it for everybody
Oh, okay,
else.
okay. Now on Colco, yes, when Colco came, the book, the Traffic Conservatism, and an earlier book on railroads and regulation came
Mhm.
out. Murray Rothbard got very excited about it, and
Mhm.
my old friend Roy Childs, the late
Mhm.
long departed Roy Childs, who ran laissez-faire books for a long time, worked for Cato, who
Mhm.
I knew very
I,
well.
I
He was
answered a phone
extremely
call from
excited.
Roy back when I was an intern at Cato. I once
Yeah,
talked to Roy on the phone in 1991. I believe he asked for
uh,
David
and
Bo's.
he used Colco against the Rand essay.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
had a direct
Mhm.
essay on it. Was
Mhm.
probably in the Libertarian Review, which was the magazine he
Mhm.
edited for a while before it folded into Inquiry magazine, which I worked for. Uh, so Colco's point was just like you said, that the progressive era was not something to tame business. It was something business wanted because they couldn't get the market. The market power turned out to not be such a great thing. You really can't get it. You got to turn to the government, which is an appealing idea for
Mhm.
libertarians.
Mhm.
Uh, if they if you want a monopoly, you got to turn to the state because you aren't going to get it in the marketplace.
Mhm.
I mean, market monopoly in the bad sense, not in the way
Yes, sure.
you praise it. And I'm all for how you talk about it in your book. But I don't know if you ever read a couple of articles by Rob Bradley and Roger Donway from at the Independent Review, and I think they had one other version of it a few years ago, which was a revisionist look at Colco,
Uh-huh.
and they pretty
Yeah,
much
see that accurate.
yanked the rug under Colco from under Colco. I guess
Hmm.
Rothbard
All
had
right,
already died.
I'm intrigued. I'm going to read them.
It's very, very interesting, and I don't know why I didn't pay enough attention when it came out. I only read it this year.
Hmm.
And they have research showing that Colco misused quotations from Andrew
Mhm.
Carnegie and other
Mhm.
businessmen, uh,
Mhm.
sometimes in a sense made up quotations or put them out of context.
Mhm.
And the big picture that Bradley and Donway remind us of was, for instance, with railroads, you'll hear where some of the railroad men said, "Okay, yeah, I favor this kind of intervention." And then that's taken out of context, saying, "See, these railroads favored intervention." But they remind us that first of all, from the get go, railroads were regarded as common carriers
Mhm.
by the government. So they were on the laissez-faire was not on the menu.
Mhm.
So they were given a menu of, okay, there's this, and this as a possible choice of public policy by government or by the regulators.
Mhm.
And so if they look for the least bad one, you can't use that to say they destroyed laissez-faire. There was no laissez-faire to destroy.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
it's a very important paper to read about Colco.
Sure. Like another thing that you can get if you're reading Colco and Weinstein, James Weinstein was a corporate ideal in the liberal state closely, is that very often, really, what even in their own possibly doctored quotations, what the business people are saying is, look, we could either have one set of federal regulations or 48 sets of state regulations, and the
That's right.
48 sets of state regulations is so burdensome, we'd rather just go with the federal regulation. But again, sort of without the idea, wait, is there some other alternative, just no regulation? And in an actual situation, and maybe no, that's not actually available. It's just a pipe dream. So what's the point? I have a great friend who works in insurance, and he has told me that's exactly how it is for insurance.
Hmm.
Is the main reason the insurance industry ever wants federal regulation is just to supplant state regulation because it is so horribly costly to comply with now 50 different sets of state insurance regulation. Even if the federal regulation is considerably stricter, it's still less burdensome
Yeah.
than 40 or 50 different states version of lax regulation because of just the incredible compliance costs. But if you were to say, well, would you rather just have no regulation? Their first regulation as actual practical businessmen is, well, that could never happen. It's like, okay, fine, but
Yeah.
what if it were? And it's like, yeah, well, I guess. But so again, that when you think about it, it's like, so it's not that they actually really want the regulation. And the cases where you really want the regulation are generally ones that are much more specific, where it's like, here's a regulation to put my competitor out of business. That one's good. Or a tariff. That's one where it's like, well, the point of a tariff is real transparent. We're going to keep out this Brazilian steel so we have the market to ourselves.
Yeah.
And yet, most regulation is actually not like that. It is actually quite burdensome overall, which actually brings me to one of the things that I noticed among left libertarians, which is there is a lot of complaint about how this regulation is really good, really good, especially for big business. It's some kind of plot to keep out small business. And when I would say, but then how do you explain all these many regulations that have a minimum firm size
Yeah.
rule? Like the rule only kicks in if you have more than 50 employees. That sure doesn't look like a regulation that was crafted for the benefit of big business. If anything, it looks like a regulation was crafted for the benefit of small business.
It does put a big tax on hiring that 50th person. It's
Correct.
a huge marginal
Correct.
tax.
Yes. So you yeah, if you were very clever and knew a lot of details, maybe that could, but still, like the general rule actually is that insofar as regulation is differentially applied, it's applied more strictly to big business, not less,
Yeah.
which again fits my view that most regulation is actually being written by demagogic politicians and regulators who realize that big business is unpopular, whereas small business at least has some affection, and therefore it's fair to go and burden big business while at least putting fewer burdens on small
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. And in fact, one thing I learned from George Selgin is that in banking,
Mm-hmm.
most of that was happening at the state level in
Mm-hmm.
the time he's talking about. But all the burden, I mean, the small business, small banks were calling the shots. I mean, there wasn't branch banking, there wasn't interstate banking for a very long time. It's
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons apparently we suffered so much from the Depression versus
Mm-hmm.
Canada, which had branch banking and national
Mm-hmm.
banking.
Yep.
And so that was all big bank, small bankers with much more power than
Mm-hmm.
the New York bankers that
Mm-hmm.
wanted to open branches around the country,
Mm-hmm.
and we suffer for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that has, David Friedman for a long time has been a critic of this oversimplified class
Mm-hmm.
conflict or class uh,
Mm-hmm.
warfare, uh, and he's pointed out, first of all, there's not a monolithic
Mm-hmm.
uh, ruling class among business because one business's benefit is every other business's burden, like
Yeah,
high
you can see
airline.
this very strongly with current protectionism, where suddenly people realizing, a large share of imports are inputs into domestic
Yeah,
business.
exactly.
So the idea that it's even good for American business in general is just wrong. I mean,
Right. So
this is
this is
best
the stuff.
illustrated when you look at a country like Luxembourg, where if you go through the math, you realize Luxembourg's exports exceed its GDP by a factor of like three. And it's just like, how can that even be? Because they are importing an enormous amount of stuff in order to export an enormous amount of stuff. That's their whole business model.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's this kind of stuff that made me, first of all, drop the word left. I don't want
Mhm.
to.
All right, but so we're moving too fast. We're moving too fast.
Okay,
All right.
one.
So then you got a period where you're thinking that left libertarians have a lot to offer, or at least
Yeah,
you.
but I never bought the predictions that were
Uh-huh.
often made explicit by the left libertarians. It never made sense to me that there wouldn't be landlords. I thought
Yes.
that's just crazy. Lots of people will be in lots of situations in life when the smart thing to do is to rent. They don't know how long they're going to be in an
Yes.
area. You can come up with a million reasons.
Well,
Or,
Kevin
and
Carson, Kevin
I
Carson
already talked
had a
about
pretty good
people not
story
wanting
about that.
business.
Right, but
Sorry.
Kevin Carson had a pretty good story about that. Namely, in his ideal system, anyone like if you didn't occupy your building, it would just get expropriated by whoever's living there,
No,
which
well,
would kill landlordism real fast.
I'm a Lockean. I'm not a Proudhonian or whatever that
Yeah,
is.
yes.
I'm more Lockean.
And when I pointed this out, he just said, "Yeah, like those people will be SOL." And I'm like, "All right. Well,
You know, no one would. That would kill
SOL is anybody who doesn't have the money to go and buy a home immediately."
Well, that would kill vacations because somebody
Yeah.
would come and take.
Yes.
Today it happens with squatters.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Or
So,
as they call
so
it,
I
as
never
they call
bought
them in
that stuff.
España, ocupas.
I,
Ocupas. Tenemos ocupas, Sheldon.
I never thought rent was going to disappear, or interest was going to
Mhm.
disappear, or profits
Yeah.
were going to disappear. That
Do
never
you
made
ever
any
much,
sense.
do you ever have any sympathy for this left libertarian idea that it's really only because of capitalism that we're not all self-employed?
No, no, no. I never believed that prediction either. I don't want to be self-employed.
Mhm.
Uh, there's a division of labor. People have different talents, interests, and most
Mhm.
people, I don't think, what the headache and the risk and the lost sleep of owning a business. It doesn't
Mhm.
surprise
Yeah, I
me.
mean, so
And
you
how many
must.
businesses fail every year?
Now, did you ever try to go and knock some intellectual sense into Kevin Carson or Rod
No,
Law?
I only met him one time in the earliest days. But here's another thing that attracted me about left libertarianism, and I still think this is constructive. I used it to write some articles in the Freeman, and pretty much, I guess, in the Freeman, where I pretended I was talking to a. I don't know how many leftists ever read anything, like socialists ever read it, but what I was saying was, this was my message. Look, leftists, good faith leftists, if there are any good faith leftists, look, good faith leftists. The market gives you what you say you want. Think of the Borders book chain, because Borders had just gone out of business. I said,
Mhm.
who put Borders out of business? We all did. Not by sitting in a big meeting and voting. This is a Mises point, and I would cite Mises. Not at a big meeting with voting, but we all decided to spend our money somewhere else, other bookstores or
Mhm.
anywhere else. And therefore, in a sense, we decided, you Borders, we don't want you to have
Mhm.
assets. So you're bankrupt now. Go do something else. Let those assets be used by somebody else. Isn't that what you say you want? That's public control of the means of production, leftist. Now, to my knowledge, I didn't convince one single leftist.
Yes.
Another thing I like to
Yeah.
use, and I did an article built on this, there's a great chapter in Bastiat's Economic Harmonies, chapter 11, which has nothing to do with bankruptcy. And so I'm sure you've read it in your lifetime, but reread it sometime. It's called something like from the from private property to the public realm, and it's a
Mhm.
brilliant chapter where he says when innovators, business people, begin to harness the free services of nature, right? The sun, water,
Mhm.
electricity. Um, they're originally able to charge and have a return on the free services, not just their own labor of harnessing it,
Mhm.
but the free services. Except under competition,
Mhm.
that free stuff is going to get that's going to get competed to zero, and
Mhm.
consumers will now be getting that aspect of the product for free. So I tried to say, hey, leftists, you should like this. The free services at first may be charged, but
Mhm.
competition, free market competition, will mean people get more and more stuff for free. Isn't that great? And he talks about it being in the put from private property into the communal realm. This is Bastiat talking. I opened the article with a quote from
Mhm.
Bastiat, but I didn't say who it was from. I said, "Who do you believe wrote? Who do you think wrote this?" And
Mhm.
people might guess that it was who knows, Marx, whoever,
Mhm.
and yet it's Bastiat. Um, I think that's a great chapter, and it's a great thing to promote, a feature of the market. Now, like I said, to my knowledge, I didn't convince a single leftist.
Mhm.
Nobody ever wrote me and said, "I've seen the light from this," and
Mhm.
I would use Mises. I wouldn't cover up the fact that it was libertarian stuff. And I was once accused by a Mises Institute person of misusing Mises for this reason, but I didn't. I didn't take anything out of context. I used quotes.
Mhm.
He talks about consumer being sovereign. The consumers are the captains. They determine who controls the means of production. Mises talks like that. So if he can talk like that, I can talk like that.
Right, which brings me to one of the most glaring errors of the left libertarians, which is probably the single most important set of regulations in first world economies are immigration restrictions. And how are those good for business to go and keep out the vast majority
Right.
of workers? I've worked on this in my research, of course.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as you and I will understand, the benefits also go to consumers too because they wind up getting all this extra production. But just from almost any point of view, the idea that business would want to go and prevent most workers from competing in their labor market is pretty crazy. And I've never really gotten any answer from left libertarians about what's their story about that. I mean, other than like, is this the great triumph of the workers, and should we be happy about this, or should
I
we?
think they'd be pro, but I'm embarrassed to say that in those early 2000s, I wasn't thinking much about immigration very much. Of course, Bush and those guys and the Republicans in that
Hmm.
early in the century were sort of favorable to it. Obviously,
Yeah,
not for
sure.
open borders,
Yeah.
so it wasn't quite the issue that it certainly has
Hmm.
become.
Hmm.
Uh, you've definitely opened my eyes to that
Hmm.
whole thing about the doubling of world wealth
Yeah.
if we had open borders everywhere. Yeah, so that's been extremely
Mhm.
important.
Right. I mean, honestly, a lot of what I've learned since becoming an economics professor is that I just had a very poor sense of what regulations were actually a really big deal and which ones were symbolic. I mean, when I was young, I was thinking about the minimum wage all the time, and it's like, well, yeah, it's a bad idea, but the share of the U.S. workforce that this even applies to is real
Yeah,
small. Actually, right now, the federal minimum wage has been effectively abolished by Biden inflation. And it's like,
yeah,
all right, well, like, so thank goodness for small miracles.
and it's a very small percentage. I think it's in your
Yes.
book.
Right. But on the other hand, things that I had very little sense of are, well, immigration restrictions are vastly more harmful than tariffs, for example, just because the tariffs are actually fairly low. And also the main reason we don't have a lot more trade is just transportation costs and that kind of thing, rather than these special taxes and regulations. Whereas for immigration, it's the other way around, precisely because the gains are so enormous. The cost of a plane ticket or a boat ticket is a rounding error compared to the gains that you get. So it really is the regulations keeping people out. And the same goes for housing regulation, which I have another book. And this
Of
is,
course.
it's stuff where it's like, well, is this some conspiracy of business? And it's like, no. And like, so then what's going on? What's going
Yeah,
is it some like clever system for consumers? No, again. Like, so what's the right story? And I said, look, it's demagoguery. It is kind of like the thing in Atlas Shrugged where you just have some irrational ideas which lead to destruction, and you come away and say, like, who gained out of this system of making it almost impossible to build stuff? And it's like, yeah, well, like it's demagogues gain because they get to go and be powerful and give speeches and rule over everybody and be little petty tyrants
yeah,
and say, no,
yeah.
you can't go and put an in-law suite in your land.
I heard of some left podcaster, and I forget who it was. It's been a while, uh, and it was probably two people, a
Mhm.
team, and they were saying like, "Well, why don't we have more housing? Why is there a housing crisis?" And the answer the other one gave was, "Oh, because big business. There's no profit in it." I think, "Are you crazy?" No, I already read.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I
Yeah.
hadn't read your book by then. I said, "Are you nuts? If big business writes the rules, if it's really rigged the way Robert Reich says it's all
Yes.
rigged by big business,
Yeah.
then why aren't they building? Why aren't they build baby building? I don't
Yeah,
understand
like,
it.
yeah, why do they just sit there on a vacant lot for 20 years, humbly asking permission to build? All right, now this brings me to last topic that I think would be cool to discuss. So the role of business lobbying in the economy. Definitely hanging out with free market economists in my youth, I was given this idea lobbying is just terrible and it's just a way where big business and business in general winds up getting restrictive regulations that are harmful for consumers, and there's something to that. But definitely looking at construction, after a while I realized, look, without business lobbying, pretty much nothing would be built in America because you have these extremely strict regulations, and the only way anything gets done is because there are businesses that go and heavily pressure politicians to give them all the permits they need, and often it's like 20 permits to get it done. And yeah, they're probably whining and dining politicians. In my neighborhood, actually, there is a acre of land that was completely vacant for 15 years. The reason it was vacant was that when the developer originally built the complex, the government said, no, we refuse to give you any we refuse to give you permission to hook you up to the sewer, and we refused your permission for a septic tank, which then meant it was a complete waste. Now, some business person kept ownership of that, and while I have no proof, I am almost certain that that person spent 15 years trying to go and talk to local politicians to get them to change that ruling, and then finally a house got built there to the benefit of society. So that's a case where I'll say, like, oh, this kind of lobbying seems highly beneficial, and anyone who likes free markets and liberty should say it's at least the best we can do right now is to have lobbying to go and undermine these regulations. And like, actually, we should be happy that it's going on because the alternative is not that we have a free market. The alternative is that nothing happens, probably. And then the question is how much regulation or how much lobbying is actually like that, where it's really businesses doing the best they can in a way where we should be happy they're doing it actually, if the alternative is just following the rules and doing nothing.
Well, no, I think I'm entirely sympathetic to what you just
Mhm.
said. What bugs me about the left, and I'm familiar with the Lewis brothers book, so I hate to
Mhm.
use the terms left and right. And
Mhm.
I know you
All right, yeah,
largely,
yeah.
I think you said
Shout
you agree with them
out to
80%.
Hiram. Shall we give a
I've
shout
seen
out?
your interview.
Oh, sorry. Can we just give a shout out to Hiram and Verlin Lewis, Myth of Left
I
and Right?
love, I love what their work, and it makes me very. I have to say left and right, or do the
Mhm.
scare quotes because I can't use the term, but I can't stand when they say we got to get money out of politics. Business constantly buying favors, and yet they still want big government. And
Mhm.
I've written several times. Nobody comes and shops in a store where there's nothing on the shelves, but they don't want nothing on the shelves. They want they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They
Mhm.
want government that's powerful enough to dispense all these favors, but they don't want people buying the favors.
Mhm.
You can't do
Right.
it.
So again, like just to be fair, again, I think what the left really wants is for all government programs to be basically like Social Security, where they're just so sacred and popular that it's hopeless to try lobbying for anything important on them. And I think it's true. Like no business would bother lobbying to get Social Security down. What would be the point? So everyone would hate you, and that's about it. And I think their dream is a world like that, where like everything that government does, it's just so graven in stone that the government is right and righteous that everyone cringes in fear and then they don't bother lobbying, which does happen for some notable cases. Although I'd say, yeah, well, like it would be terrible if people cringed in fear in the face of housing regulation because then there would be nothing built.
Right. And we are seeing a few leftists come over to your side on housing.
Yeah, so like most people call themselves YIMBYs or leftists. That's totally true. Also worth pointing out that a much larger number of anti-housing activists are also left wing. Right?
Yeah.
And like it is totally true that more left-wing places have a lot more housing regulation. They also have bigger YIMBY movements, but it's kind of it's fairly straightforward. It's like, well, you need to have a lot of regulation before you can get a big movement against the regulation. In the less regulated states, there isn't the same impetus, and housing prices are much more reasonable.
I haven't read the book by Ezra Klein and his
Mhm.
co-author on abundance,
Yep,
where
Jared
he's
Thompson.
supposedly, like a conventional liberal, which
Yes.
means not enthusiastic about the market, coming
Mhm.
around and saying, well, maybe we have too much government. Does
Yeah.
does he talk about housing in that book? You would
Yeah,
know
there's
much.
housing out. So definitely Ezra and Derek are big
Good.
YIMBYs. Yes, yes, in my backyard,
Okay, great.
and they got to. Yeah, housing is the main topic that they actually discuss. While the Times
Oh, okay.
pundits actually, one of my main criticisms is, all right, housing's great, and I think almost anyone who's paid attention knows that. And then what about all these other issues? And
So
that's actually fairly skittish because they would have to go after a lot of their erstwhile political friends to go and criticize other kinds of government.
they realize the government has to get out of the way with respect to housing.
Yes, yes. So definitely housing, I think
Okay,
they're quite good.
good.
Um,
But that's going to make
not as good
leftists
as you or
nervous
me,
because
Sheldon, but I don't ask for miracles.
and that's going to be interesting to see
Mhm.
how it develops. I know my
Yeah,
son is keeping a
yeah.
close eye on this,
Ah.
but because there's they could see it as a danger. I think maybe you
Mhm.
just said something
Mhm.
getting at this point. They may see the case for getting the government out of the way with housing, and they may like the idea that that'll ease up things for a lot of people. On the other hand, they'll say, "Oh my gosh, what are we setting in motion? Get the government out of the way." People might start applying that to other areas, not just housing,
Mhm. Oh
and
yeah.
so there's how are they going to finesse that? I don't know.
Mhm. So yeah, let's end with this one other example. So take a company like Walmart. Now I've heard left libertarians saying, "Oh, they're terrible. Like they're just trying to go and lobby to get a bunch of government services and without paying property taxes. They when they're deciding where to build a new store, they go and negotiate with the governments to try to get the best deal." And my reaction to all this is actually a much worse deal than Walmart would get in the free market. I mean, think about this. So these local government services generally paid for by property taxes. And Walmart pays the same property tax rate as a homeowner, even though Walmart does not send any children to school. Right? Walmart does not use local hospitals. Walmart uses roads, things like that. But basically, in a competitive market, Walmart would be getting a much bigger discount on the price they're paying for these services than residences, precisely because they don't use a lot of services.
Yeah.
Like this is where I would say, like, libertarians, rather than saying, oh, like how dare they go and try lobbying for the special deal, would say, look, in a free market, they would be getting a way better deal than this, and like why would you go and condemn a business for just going and negotiating in the situation, like if you were in their shoes, do you think it would be wrong to go and tell some local governments, I'm going to cite my new store
Well,
in the
yeah,
location where you treat me better than the other four local governments?
I think you give this a much fuller account than left libertarians have given it, and look, unfortunately, we live in a world of states, or we live in the United States that has a very active, first of all, 50 state governments, but also the federal government. So you have a choice. If you're going to be in business, you have either close down the business and go become, a monk or something, or you're going to have to manage your business in a world where the state potentially can have its hands in everything. So
Mhm.
I'm much more sympathetic to somebody in that situation than I would have been, 20 years, 20 years ago,
Yeah. I
15
mean, to
years
me,
ago.
the ultimate chutzpah is left libertarian professors working at state universities going and saying that Walmart is bad for trying to get a discount on the property taxes. And it's like, look, they're producing a ton of useful stuff. You're basically getting paid to do your hobby. And like, who the hell are you to go and criticize them, man?
Yeah, yeah. I feel differently, and again, I still think it was a matter of emphasis. I mean,
Mhm.
I I wasn't certainly ready to dump my devotion to the free market. That was never even a thought
You,
in
you,
my
you
mind.
did have a period when you stopped using the word capitalist, right? And capitalism is, and I think there was a period you said, I don't advocate.
I did think that that word was so, freighted with baggage
Mhm.
that, and I'm not the only one. I mean, Hayek was not
Mhm.
fond of the word.
Mhm.
Another Carson, Clarence Carson, who
Mhm.
was sort of a conservative libertarian, wrote for the Freeman in the early days, throughout the 50s and 60s. He didn't like the word, and but I think that's, first of all, you can't change the language. No person can change the language. We we
Mhm.
can call it laissez-faire cap, like Rand did. Rand said,
Yeah.
"When I say capitalism, I mean laissez-faire capitalism, not mixed economy."
Yes.
And so I don't think it's a dirty word. I might
Yeah.
have said I would have avoided it, yeah, 15 years ago, but not today.
Yeah. I mean, etymologically, it is stupid because to say I'm a capitalist means that you run a business. It doesn't mean that you
Right,
follow
there's a
a
vagueness there.
system.
Is it? Yeah,
And yet, and then again, also the word suggests that it's a system that's primarily beneficial for capitalists. And yet again, like you said,
yeah.
like to go and fight the whole word on, fight the whole world over this word just seems beyond quixotic. I mean, to me, it's just like Dan Klein trying to go and revive the word liberalism. Where I'll say, look, like
Well, I haven't given up liberalism.
like it's so confusing. Basically, do you want to spend the very few seconds of somebody's attention span that you have on telling that you use a word in an unusual way, or do you want to
Look,
just get to the bottom of it?
the language might have worked out differently and brought us to this situation where
Mhm.
the two main contending parties when it came to a social system were
Mhm.
statism on the one hand
Mhm.
and socialism on the other hand,
Mhm.
right? Because
Yeah, I
decision
agree. I
making,
agree. Yeah.
and I learned this from James Dale Davidson, who was the founder of
Mhm.
the National Taxpayers Union, a
Mhm.
very libertarian
Mhm.
guy. And he wrote a book called The Squeeze about how the middle class is
Mhm.
squeezed. This was back in the 80s. And
Mhm.
he used the term a socialization, he favored a socialization of rules. That got me thinking because that's
Yeah.
bottom up
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
processes.
like etymologically, it's great. I mean,
Yeah,
actually, I'll tell you something even crazier. Like, I think that with from a blank slate, the best name for economics would be sociology. Because
yeah,
we don't just study business, we study all of society. So wouldn't it be great if our
yeah,
field was just called sociology? And yet I would not be
right,
such a fool as to start calling myself a
yeah,
sociologist and try to get everyone to change the word. It would just be so confusing and it would just be a
right.
giant waste of my life to try to fight for a word when, again, the reason why people don't like the word capitalism, for example, is because they don't like the stuff that's good about it. They don't like the fact that it's a system where people go and produce for profit and try to make money, and they don't like the consumerism.
But what could be better than a system? And this takes us back to one of my earlier remarks. What could be better than a system that people pursue their personal profit by making your life better?
Mhm. Of course, one where people pursue make your life better out of the goodness of their hearts. That's the right system, Sheldon.
Yeah, but who cares? That's
Sheldon,
right. It's
Sheldon
not
is
good enough.
system based upon everyone helping Sheldon.
And they're gonna love me,
Yeah.
not because they're gonna profit. They have to love. They want to. I want them to do it because they love me. That's a
Yeah.
little crazy.
Yeah.
That sounds a little crazy.
Well, I
I
like you
don't want
enough that I
Jeff
kind of like
Bezos
the
to
idea of
give me great
Sheldonism, but
service and products. I want him to love me and give me great.
yeah.
That's
All right.
nuts.
So we've had a great conversation here, Sheldon. Really appreciate it. It's
I
always,
loved it.
it's always my privilege to get to spend any time with you at all. I miss you. I
Thank
remember
you.
fondly
Same
those
here.
days in
Same here. I
1991.
mean,
Yeah, and just to have this conversation inspired by my latest book of essays, so pro market and pro business essays on
the
laissez-faire.
only disappointment I had in that book was there were no pictures.
That's
Just
expensive.
kidding. Just
Yes,
kidding.
yes. All right. So can we agree that everyone should be pro market and pro business, Sheldon?
Yes,
All right,
definitely.
awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, buddy. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
getting to talk to you, and let's do it again soon. Bye bye.
Great. Bye bye.